She went down head first and inclined at an angle. That is, when she took her final plunge, she was inclined at an angle of about 75 degrees. After getting clear of the ship, the lights were still burning very bright, but as we got away, she seemed to go lower and lower, and she almost stood up perpendicular and her lights went dim, and presently she broke clean in two, probably 2/3 of the length of the ship, 1/3 of the aft funnel sticking up. The after part floated back, then there was an explosion, and the aft part turned on end and sank.
The end was very close. It came with a deafening roar that stunned me. Something in the very bowels of the Titanic exploded and millions of sparks shot up into the sky. This red spurt was fan-shaped as it went up, but the sparks dispersed in every direction in the shape of a fountain of fire. 2 other explosions followed, dull and heavy. As if below the surface, the Titanic broke in two before my eyes. The forepart was already partly under the water. It wallowed over and vanished instantly. The stern reared straight on end and seemed poised on the ocean for many seconds. They seemed minutes to us. It was only then that the electric lights on board went out.
She went slowly down, bow first with a slight list to starboard until the water reached the bridge. Then she went quicker. When the third funnel had nearly disappeared, I heard 4 explosions, which I took to be the bursting of the boilers. The ship was right up on end then. Suddenly, she broke in two between the third and fourth funnel. The after part of the ship came down on the water in its normal position, and seemed to me as if it was going to remain afloat. But it only remained a minute or two, then it sank. The lights were burning right up until she broke in two.
We could see the ship gradually going down, but all the lights were on, when suddenly 2 terrible explosions took place. The ship seemed to go forward, and then split in the middle, and then there were 2 more explosions that seemed from underneath the water. We got about 2 miles from the Titanic and watched her sink. She just broke in two, and the ends were sticking up for only about 5 minutes. Then, with a mighty and tearing sob, as of some gigantic thing instinct with life, the front portion of her dived into the sea, and the after part, with a heavy list, also disappeared. For a few moments we could see everything that was happening, for as the vessel sank, millions and millions of sparks flew up and lit everything around us. There was a tremendous explosion. Bang, bang, bang. And the forepart of the ship went down, and her stern was stuck up in the air at a terrible angle for a while, and then just settled, leaned over, and went down. I am so convinced that the ship is not whole. I am sure it is in 2 halves.
The propellers was up in the air, and after 10 minutes we heard a sound as the engines fell off the blocks, and then she just slid down under the water.
When about half a mile off, we heard 2 explosions and rumbling noises. Directly afterwards, she seemed to break in two, and the stern to partly right itself for a brief period. The lights were burning to the last. We rowed about 3/4 of a mile from the ship. By this time, the water was up to the bridge of the doomed vessel. The bow settled long before the stern. Suddenly, we heard an explosion, and in 2 minutes, a second followed. All the lights then went out. She seemed to break in two. The stern went down. There was no trouble for us to see it. There seemed to be a black cloud come up as the head went down. This settled, and the ship appeared to be broken at the middle. Finally, there was a second report, more muffled than the first, and the bodies came over the side of the ship by the hundreds. The ship had gone down right after the second explosion, after the bow was submerged by water, and the propellers were raised up out of the water. We had been in the water about 15 minutes when the first explosion occurred. That was what finished her. If she had broken in two, the after part would have floated, for she was not ripped all the way along by the collision. The stern came down after the first explosion, and 15 minutes later came another explosion, which must have been her aft boilers, for the stern went right up, and all the lights went out. Then we heard the most awful noise one could possibly hear. Her machinery shifted with a grinding roar, and there were dreadful shrieks and cries on board and around her in the sea. And then, about 15 minutes later, and 45 minutes from the time we entered the water, she plunged. The ship sank slowly and steadily, and then we heard a little explosion that must have been the first boiler. After that, the lights began to go out in different parts of the ship. Then came a big explosion. We could see a mass of black smoke. The boat seemed to lift right up out of the water and tilt on end, and then seemed to break and drop back. For one moment, she was right up in the air, standing on her nose. Afterwards, we saw the forepart of the ship break away, and it appeared to us that when the ship had listed heavily to port, the engines fell out and crashed through the side. The second funnel broke off and killed a number of men in its fall. There was a terrible rumbling sound, which we believe was the machinery breaking and tearing through the hull. And this was the end of it. The Titanic and all remaining on board her were swallowed up in the ocean. When we were 500 or 600 yards from her, her propellers were far above water. Just before she was lost sight of, there was a rumbling, and I believe the boilers and engine must have broken away, crashed through the forward bulkheads.